Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Father's Day at the Black Health Trust. I would like to welcome all of those who are not only with us live, but all of those who will join us via YouTube or Facebook, and those who are going to watch this program in the archive. I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Randall Maxey, our founder.
Good afternoon, everyone. Happy Father's Day. We're going to have some fun today, Dr. Walks and I. We're not deep in the heart of Alabama like some of our co-moderators are right now. I'm going to share a few slides with you. If Simon can help me get that going. I'm having trouble finding my pointer here. Simon, maybe you can put the slides up.
All right.
You can project yours, right?
Give me like 2 seconds.
While we're getting the slides up, Dr. Maxey, our sermon topic in church this morning was fatherhood by any means necessary.
Wow,
So
I like that.
it was quite the morning at church today.
Let me try mine in, Simon. Let's see here. That's mine, right? You can see him?
That's yours. We can see him, Dr. Maxey. And you're about to click on the slideshow icon there. Oh, there you go.
Okay. So happy Father's Day. I speak to you today with the intention that I want to first remind you how deeply loved you fathers are, especially by your Heavenly Father.
Amen.
You are the apple of God's eye, and He is well pleased with you. I want to take this opportunity to tell you how much you're appreciated, and we want to honor all of the fathers among us. And we want to remind dads that they play an important role in their children's lives. Bless you and bless everybody on the line, mothers and fathers alike. So today I want to talk a bit about Juneteenth and how that famous date has an effect, or should have an effect, hopefully positive, on our lives from now on. In 2021, President Joe Biden signed a bill that Juneteenth, or June 19th, was a federal holiday. Currently, 28 states recognize the holiday, and a majority of them give the government workers the day off. I don't know if they do that in Florida or not, but in the human states, they give them the day off. So the holiday began as a Texas tradition. In 1863, the Emancipation Proclamation legally freed enslaved people in the Confederate States that were in rebellion against the Union. On June 19th in 1865, Union troops reached Texas to announce that the enslaved people were free. They didn't know it. So Juneteenth is a day of celebration of freedom. Why am I not moving? Simon, maybe we are going to need your slides.
There we go.
Okay, so we do know that Africans helped establish the colonies. Hundreds of thousands of slaves, Africans, both free and enslaved, aided the establishment and survival of the colonists in the Americas and the New World. Many consider a significant starting point of slavery to be 1619, when a privateer, a pirate ship called the White Lion, brought 20 enslaved Africans ashore in the British colony of Jamestown, Virginia. The crew had seized the Africans from the Portuguese slave ship Sao João, or Sao How, I don't know how to say that, Batista. So they got hijacked. What do you call that? A carjacking or a boat jacking, Dr. Walks?
I call it just a bad situation, going from one slave ship to another.
No. So throughout the 17th century, Europeans wanted to have slave labor because it was cheaper. Everything's about economics. Some historians say that maybe 6 or 7 million enslaved people were imported to the New World during the 18th century. And this deprived the continent of Africa of some of its healthiest and ablest men and women. The U.S. Constitution. At the time of the first Constitutional Convention, the majority of the new nation citizens lived in cities like Philadelphia and Boston, while the southern states were more rural and sparsely populated. African Americans and enslaved peoples made a full 40% of the South's population. Well, the southern delegates wanted them to be counted along with white citizens, even though they couldn't vote, when they calculated how many representatives would come to Congress. The northern people argued that since slaves were property, they didn't require representatives. So we see the same problem we have now goes back to the beginning of how this whole country was designed. So they had a ugly debate, and Blacks were considered only 3/5 of a person. This is how they decided to do it, to make each Black person equal to only 3/5 of a white person. And this is how they did the Congress, and this is how they did the Electoral College way back when. This is why voting rights now is still such an issue, especially in those so-called southern and red states. So what is race? And I want to talk about that just a minute. It's nothing that's based upon scientific fact. It's a social political construct to control power based on how people look. It's derived from white supremacy, where they originally wanted to suppress and control American Indians in the colonies, and they put them under chattel slavery. The Nazis actually copied the American idea of race and racism. And they made the Jews and Romanians, Slavics, and Blacks, etc., less than human. They declared the Jewish people were an inferior race, and then they created Jewish ghettos and genocide. So race is not directly related to any continental population, any ancestry in that way. Race is not directly related to any medical condition. As a research or clinical variables, race is a poor indicator of biology and a strong indicator of an exposure to racism. Race is socially assigned and equals how society sees you and thinks of you. So in 1735, there was a scientist named Carl Linnaeus. He's the father of modern taxonomy, or how we classify animals and stuff, and bugs, etc. And he decided that he wanted to characterize people. So Americanus, or the American Indian, was defined as obstinate, merry, free, regulated by customs. Asiaticus, or Asians, were melancholy, avaricious, ruled by opinions, Afrikaners, blacks, women without shame, crafty, negligent, governed by caprice. Europeans or whites were muscular, genteel, sanguine, inventive, and governed by laws, like a certain former president. Despite its official status in government, research, and health professions, the term race is a misnomer. There's only one race, the human race, Homo sapiens. And government definitions tend to change as time goes by. So racism is a denigrating to disadvantaged peoples. It's by design. It unfairly disadvantages certain communities in all things, economics, health, everything. Structural racism in particular is the basis of how the United States has worked. It's personally mediated, but more than that, the worst part is it becomes internalized in the victims of racial politics. So the white race is how society, while race is how society sees you and thinks of you, racism equals what society does to you based on how it sees you. Race is a risk factor for racism, but racism is a risk factor for poor health. For our patients, think first, not what's wrong with them, but what has happened to them. So in the following slides, I just want to speak very briefly that the inequalities is a major health effector, and it especially helps people of Black origin. Their education is a problem. Their healthcare and quality and access to it is a problem. There's a problem with the neighborhoods that many people live in. There's a problem with the social networks they have, and there's certainly an economic problem that affects your health all along. There's a word called allostasis. In the dictionary definition, it's the process by which a state of internal physiological equilibration is maintained by an organism in response to actual or perceived environment and psychological stressors. Allostatic load is the wear and tear on the body that accumulates in an individual's life as they're exposed to repeated or chronic stress. So what are these stressors? Stressors represent the physiological consequences of chronic exposure to fluctuating or heightened neural things, neural conduction responses, which result in prolonged chronic stress. What does that really look like? This affects your mortality and morbidity, which is illness. Allostatic load can make you sick. It can kill you. It can affect your cardiovascular system, your heart rate, your systolic and diastolic blood pressures, your heart rate variability. It can affect your immune response, your C-reactive protein, your fibrinogen, your IL-6, which you remember how all the people got cryoglobulins and had problems with COVID from IL-6 and cytokines. It affects your metabolic responses, such as your BMI, your weight to height ratio, your glucose and lipid homeostasis, and that's heart attacks, right? Your neuroendocrine responses, such as catecholamine, cortisol, DHA, and your thyroid hormone. Adverse childhood experiences, discrimination, neglect, violent parenting, morbidity, childhood, your socioeconomic status, stress, adult stress, all of that is extremely important. And here's where I may need your visual help, Dr. Walks. Looking at the effects of racism on health. Can you tell me about the panel on the left?
So on the left, we have adverse childhood experiences, such as abuse, discrimination, neglect, or violent parenting, that can lead to a certain kind of imprinting. Also, on that left side, we have exposure to childhood SES, socioeconomic stressors, such as education, financial situation, occupation, etc. And again, these are imprinting and resulting in stress that can lead to, I'm going to the second row now, Dr.
Yes.
Maxey, that can lead to adult stress, aging, which we all go through, but I think this is looking at premature aging, health behaviors, post-traumatic stress disorder. So you have mediators. These are mediators and moderators of those particular, that particular imprinting. Is that fair to say, Dr. Maxey?
Yes.
Okay. And then going on to how that stress is impacting us, we have attenuators and moderators of that. Certainly in our resilience to that is impacted by coping mechanisms and strategies that we have, such as games, music, other things, educational attainment. So you're saying, Dr. Maxey, that even if you go all the way to get an MD and a PhD, you can still, that may mediate things a little bit, but it's still going to get you attention.
Yes, absolutely.
Then our health behaviors. In other words, if I'm sitting up on the couch while you're out taking a walk and exercising, you'll probably be in better shape than I will be.
Yes, but go back to that other one, that attenuators and mediators. The discussion that's going on the news with Obama and Tim Scott.
Okay.
About being the exception. And this speaks more to what Obama is saying than what Tim Scott is saying. But go ahead with the third one.
So if it's relevant, Dr. Maxey, give us a little summary of what that, because those are our two significant leaders in our country at this point.
Okay, well, the only significant leader to me is Obama between those two. But
okay.
What Tim Scott says is that he doesn't have to be the exception. It was no problem for him. He just is because the opportunity was there. Obama says, I am what I am, but even though I am, I had to struggle to get there. And that has an imprintation on you, on your life. And in the next column, for how it affects your strain and how you adapt, that's where the problem comes in. Read that column.
I shall. So the one thing that I didn't get to on the previous column was social supports. We talk a lot about how it takes a village, and unfortunately, some people don't have that kind of social support. So they're missing. And today we can think about they're missing fathers, and they're missing social supports of many kinds. So the strain on us from a health perspective is where we struggle with the adaptation, that allostatic load that you were talking about, Dr. Maxey. Many examples of that. I'm happy to run through them. Okay, our cardiovascular response, for example, heart rate. You'll have to tell me what all of these abbreviations mean, because remember, we have a lay audience and we want to make sure that everybody understands what we're talking about.
Okay.
So heart rate, that one is HR. I got that one. SDP.
That's systolic blood pressure, diastolic blood pressure, and heart rate variability. And then the next one is immune response.
Okay.
Such as C-reactive, the fibrinogen, your blood clots more. Remember people talking about increased blood clots that were happening during COVID? Both from the COVID itself as well as from the vaccine. And IL-6 is the precursor to the cytokines.
Yep.
And the metabolic response, the basal metabolic rate, the weight to height ratio, the glucose and lipid metabolism and homeostasis. And then I'm using my whatever the saying is, microscope, the neuroendocrine response, how your glucose to control your obesity and your cortisol and your thyroid. I think I read those.
You did very well. So for those of us who want to try to use as few smart person and SAT words as possible, this impacts all of the different parts of your body and how your body functions, and this is bad. So if you go all the way to the end of this, you see that the outcome or the expression of this is morbidity change and mortality change, and those changes aren't good. We're sick more and we're dying faster.
Right. Okay. And this one too, if you don't mind.
So the effects of racism on overall health, for all the reasons that we've been talking about, poorer sleep, psychiatric problems such as depression, anxiety disorders, post-traumatic stress disorder, eating disorders. The last one I cannot make out.
Inflammation.
Inflammation. That is not inflammation. Anyway, but inflammation too. Cardiovascular disease, coronary heart disease, higher BMI and obesity, high blood pressure, stress hormone deregulation, and then the bottom there is inflammation. Dr. Maxey, later on, I'm going to see if we can get Dr. Lawson, who's on, to talk a little bit about some of the psychiatric disorders that are directly related that we're talking about.
Excellent. Thank you. So what made me think of how the stress can affect you, I did a talk at another meeting a few weeks ago, and we learned several years ago about Black patients having more kidney disease than the rest of the world. And there happens to be a gene and a gene variant that occurs on the 22nd spot on the chromosome, and it's called APLO1. Now, you may not be interested in that gene, but let me just tell you why I wanted to speak about it a minute. There's a genetic cause of chronic kidney disease if that gene is varied in certain ways. And it's more prevalent in people that have African ancestry, especially from West Africa. So having one high risk gene for CKD does not cause CKD. But if you have two high risk genes, variants, it does increase your risk. However, it does require a second hit. Bear with me a moment. So there are environmental stressors that happen that can cause this gene to be activated. One is a viral infection, such as HIV. Another one is autoimmune disease, such as systemic lupus erythematosus, which is more common in dark-skinned people, right? Inflammatory or high-risk things such as SLE, again, HIV, and more things, but also stress itself can be a second hit. Ischemic things such as sickle cell anemia can cause it. And allograft, such as have a kidney transplant, can cause that gene to be activated. What it looks like in a cartoon, in these columns A, B, C, see that the risk allele, a second hit happens and it causes chronic kidney disease and hypertension. Another one, a second hit comes after hypertension, that can cause chronic kidney disease. And another one where they both are hit again. So it is your environment that can affect your genetic trends that are already there. And stress can be one of those itself. So the takeaway on this, we want everybody to continue to be resilient, eat a healthy diet, more fruits and vegetables, exercise, be active, both physically and mentally, get sleep and rest. Sleep is akin to and renewal. Get a primary care health provider, as Dr. Jordan used to tell us all the time. And we all know, always we say every week, every day, use your common sense. So now we can have some questions, discussion. And if Dr. Lawson's on, I'd like him to make comments, Dr. Walks, on what we've talked about and how this stress thing can affect your body and how we can all have a better day of Juneteenth as time goes on.
So let me, first of all, thank you, Dr. Maxey, for putting that slide presentation together and giving us the great information that you did. We have routinely experts that join us on Sunday afternoon. One of our regular attendees is Dr. William Lawson, one of our nation's treasures in the field of mental health, particularly psychiatry and behavioral health. Dr. Lawson is a past professor emeritus. I could spend the next half hour, but I won't. Dr. Lawson, let's see if we can get you unmuted and speak to some of the issues that Dr. Maxey raised with respect to the mental health impact of these societal labels and societal constructs that impact our community on a day-to-day basis. I don't know if Dr. Lawson can get that mute button done and talk to us for a minute. Still not unmuted, Dr. Lawson. So while we're trying to get Dr. Lawson unmuted, there we go. Dr. Lawson?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. Can you talk to us for a few minutes?
Sure. The hot dogs are roasting. You know, we're having a Father's Day barbecue, but I can talk.
Hello, Dr. Lawson.
I was invited to Dr. Lawson's Father's Day event, Dr. Maxey. You never invited me to yours, but Dr. Lawson invited me to his.
Well, I didn't get invited, Dr. Lawson. I'm hurt.
Okay, I'll catch you next time. I'll send a plane for you.
So,
Okay.
so Dr. Lawson, the question is, as Dr. Maxey shared, many of the mental health challenges that we talk about, depression, anxiety, those kinds of things, Dr. Maxey was drawing a line between some of the societal, racial, and racist constructs and insults that we're impacted with, and how those can lead to some of those mental health challenges.
Yeah, the issue is not whether or not exposed to stress and so forth and cause you to feel bad. The problem is that if it's sustained and it's environment and folks do not get recognize that these are challenges, you can reduce persisting problems. So I already recognize this. I know the Association of Black Psychologists showed early that these kind of challenges what are contributing to high rates of diabetes and hypertension in our communities. We're now recognizing, especially after COVID, that we're seeing persisting anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder, persisting depression that continues long after the exposure to the stressful event is going on, because of appreciation to realize that we aren't dealing with a stressful event. We're dealing with an embryonic problem that is in the background. Institutional racism.
Ice making.
Somebody needs to mute.
It's done. Go ahead, Dr. Lawson.
So the issue is, the problem is what we have to deal with is, even though the stressful event and the consequence is gone, people still live with these problems. It has produced brain changes. We see changes in terms of the hippocampus, associated memory, and we're seeing structural changes in terms of it that's leading to such persisting problems as post-traumatic stress disorder. And of course, there's some folks who are saying that there's probably a change in terms of DNA that is a contributing factor to what we now recognize as post-traumatic stress that's cross-generational. So all of these factors, environment as well as our genetics, interact to lead to persisting problems that are not very treatment responsive, or even if we make things better.
So there also, we use the word ACE, adverse childhood events. And I see Dr. X-Line being on, and we know that children have events that set them up early on for problems in later life. Is Dr. Bean available to just comment on adverse childhood events?
Well, good afternoon, y'all. Happy Father's
Good
Day to
afternoon.
all of you. And as you said, adverse childhood events have now been documented to be associated with long-term changes and in children and actually into adulthood. And we have, the interesting thing is that we have been talking about adverse childhood events for years, and there's great research which looks, and they usually look at it from the perspective of the adult. In other words, when you do
Thank you, sir.
when you do adult studies and you look for adverse childhood experiences, there is a disproportionate amount of adverse childhood experiences, not surprisingly, among adults who are also experiencing adverse outcomes. So you're looking at people who are in the criminal justice system, people who are substance abuse, but also people who have, as was pointed out, a disproportionate burden of healthcare problems, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, et cetera. And it is those issues which people are particularly concerned about. And the question is, how do we go about translating the fact that we know what the outcome is in adults, identifying them in children, and preventing them from progression? And unfortunately, we have not gotten very good at that. And I would be interested in some of what my colleagues have to say. Just recently, after many, many years, CMS has finally decided, for example, that one of the things that all of the insurance companies, or all of the companies that do TennCare, in Tennessee it's TennCare, which is Medicaid, have to come up with some mechanism of assessing adverse childhood experiences. And most of them have adopted some kind of questionnaire. So again, it's an attempt to at least say we should have some formal mechanism of incorporating how to identify adverse childhood experiences as part of a healthcare issue, which I think is a good thing. But basically, all you have to do is fill out the questionnaire and identify that they have adverse childhood experiences or adverse experiences, but you're not required to do anything. So at this point, though, I think part of our problem is we don't exactly know what we're supposed to do, but we do know what happens if we don't do anything. And so consequently, at least at this point, we are beginning to identify it in childhood and then ask the question of how do we begin to address it so that we will decrease the burden when we get to adulthood, at least from of the medical issues as well as the social issues. And so I'd be really interested to see what some of my colleagues have to say.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Bean. Dr. Walsh, any comments or in the chat or anything, or any mics we need to open?
Let me take a look in the chat. No questions in the chat at this point. I have a question for you, Dr. Maxey. Sometimes folks get, let me not say folks, let me say me. Sometimes I need help with where the line is or what the interface is or how you sort out. We talked about the fact that there's only one race, the human race. We talked about the fact that race is a social construct. And then we talked about the fact that depending on where folks come from, you mentioned one example of folks of West African descent having a gene that can make them more susceptible to that second hit that can result in a health outcome that is undesired, right? So it sounds like we're talking about races that we're all just part of the human race, but then we know that there are certain genetic illnesses, predispositions, and all of that. So how do we reconcile the two?
Well, first of all, we know scientifically that race is an American construct.
Okay.
So it's not really scientific. Now, there are differences. We come from different continents. We have different exposures. We have different gene variants. And Blacks are not the only one that have gene variants. There's Tay-Sachs disease. There's all sorts of things that people who consider themselves Ashkenazi Jews, Sephardic Jews, they have problems. Every group in the world has problems. I chose to focus on what's happening with African Americans. So that's why it may seem in our thing. But a few months ago, I was very insulted in working with some private equity people who were Caucasian. And they didn't want to wear masks around people in Puerto Rico in our dialysis centers. And they said those people are just, it's their fault. They have all these pre-existing conditions. They eat too much, they're too fat, they have too much diabetes. But what has really turned out to be that it is not the Puerto Ricans' fault, not the African Americans' fault, but this is scientifically trying to show how much of these disparities in health are not self-caused, but they're a result of different stressors of structural racism. And it's very important that you not blame the patient for having the disease. Obesity is not always just because you eat too much. It's because many things about your hormones, your ventral medial nucleus, and many of your gene variants that have happened. Even this one that I talked about, APL01, this gene was very back from 10,000 years ago. It had nothing to do with what you or I did. But we need to be aware of it, and we need to be as healthy as possible with our rest, with our eating habits, with our being active mentally and physically. But to understand that it is not racial, it may be ethnic, it may be genetic from where you come from, but it's not a part of race, so to speak.
No, that's very helpful, Dr. Maxey. Dr. Stephen Thomas put a couple of references in the chat that that look like they may be very useful for us. And I don't know if Dr. Thomas can unmute and give us a few words about this collection of information that you put in the chat, Dr. Thomas.
I challenge you to unmute, doctor. You never unmute
No,
yourself.
Dr. Thomas is ready to go this time, Dr. Maxey.
Oh, okay, good.
Is my audio working?
Yes, sir.
Well, what a fascinating conversation. And that's what I think is so important. And I want to point you to our Cutting Edge show, which focused on internalized racism, saving ourselves. And there were some psychologists on and teachers. I think that we have to really look at the fact that in many of our cities where we have African-American control of the public school systems, there are issues that are issues of the structural racism. And so that show brought a lot of those things out, and I highly recommend. The other thing has to do with people want to do something. They're ready to take action. And a lot of what they're learning from the pandemic that we're talking about here today, they'll say, yeah, that's our lives. That's what we've been living. Now, what do we do? So I put the Booker T. Washington piece up there because, as you know, the CDC has changed the language from pandemic preparedness to pandemic readiness. And when you want to get ready, that means you have to practice. The Negro Health Week used the Black church revival, something that people understood at the local level. But instead of every day of the week being a different part of the Bible, it was a different health topic. They did this for 35 years. It's a playbook. So while we're waiting to solve the big problem of the American healthcare system is terribly, terribly broken, the people need action right now. And I think that reenacting the Negro Health Movement, providing people local funding to do that, listening sessions, they're activated. They're finally listening to us. But many of my clinical partners that came out to the community during the pandemic, they're all retreating. Dr. Walks, they're all retreating back to the hospital walls. They personally want to come out, but that structural racist system is keeping them from coming out. So that's why I come here to the Black Health Trust This is a chance that we can reimagine bringing healthcare right to the corner. People are literally changing their lives, Dr. Walks, and they're reversing the symptoms of type 2 diabetes for the very things you just talked about in that slide. But we're doing it on a shoestring.
Well,
Doing
thank
it
you,
on a shoestring.
Dr. Thomas. And we definitely need to talk more about the whole economic movement that we need to do.
And Maryland could be a model. We got a governor here that's ready to put all the pieces in place, Dr. Walks.
Yes,
The
he is.
governor's Wellmo bill. How might we liberate that Wellmo bill and liberate all the other mobile units that are sitting in parking lots around the country and take it right to where we know people are in need? Thank you very much.
Thank you.
sir.
Let's ask what's going on and how racism, does it affect people in Jamaica? Or is that, since everybody's mostly one race, maybe racism doesn't affect people in Jamaica health-wise? I don't know.
Dr. Lisa Kervin-Dawes, can you comment on Dr. Maxey's statement? Dr. Maxey, everybody's not mostly one race in Jamaica. I've spent some time there.
Okay.
It's a very interesting place. Beautiful and wonderful place. And
Can
very
Dr.
interesting.
Dawes be unmuted?
Dr. Dawes, go right ahead, ma'am.
Hi, so can you repeat the question again? We are different, I mean, we are very mixed up here, but what was the exact question? Because I just walked in and out of the room.
Oh, the question was, does racism have a major effect in Jamaica?
Actually, yes. We have, actually the best person to talk about that who actually did a paper on that is my daughter, Sage. But yes, it does. Because of slavery, a lot of people that still run a lot of the institutions are white. We still have a fair amount of colorism in that if you're considered lighter skin, you are actually favored. A lot of positions still held in some of the companies are held by white or actually, interestingly, Hispanics, Chinese, or Indians. So we do still suffer for a lot of racism. Yeah, we do. It's unfortunate but true. And one of the problems we're having with it is people bleaching because they think by bleaching and being lighter colored, they will have more privilege.
Wow.
And just to support that, Dr. Kervin-Dawes, my limited experience in Jamaica, you also have that diversity of resources going along with the racism. So it can be a huge challenge for many communities.
It is definitely so. Definitely. It is becoming better because you can be a successful dark-skinned Black male here and be quite successful. Interestingly enough, most of those men, however, will marry Hispanic or very light, what we call Jamaica white, which means you're mixed, but you can pass. And my daughter comments because, I mean, I can say a little bit about my family. My grandfather was a Jew, a white Jew running from Europe, and part stayed, came and stopped in Jamaica, and part went to the US. So my family is quite mixed, and we have some very light-skinned people. And they will say they know that they get a certain amount of privilege. And how do you deal with that? Because the children are aware. You're called, you're a Browning, and you're considered more attractive.
So thank you so much, Dr. Dawes. Simon, I wonder if you can go back to the slides and pick the one that says mortality, morbidity. What I want to demonstrate is this is not just psychology or psychiatric, but it affects your physiology as well. If you can find that slide, just project it a moment.
Dr. Maxey, while that slide's coming up, on behalf of Dr. Lawson, I'm going to forgive you for saying not just psychiatry, but affects your physiology as well. I'm struggling now on Father's Day to forgive you for saying that.
Well, I erred in trying to separate the mind from the body. It's all one.
You cannot. And you know what? And the fact that with your tremendous scholarship and academic accomplishments, that even you would say that, it's just an indication of, again, a societal construct. We really, I spend so much time trying to educate my patients about the fact that doctors have a medical model. We diagnose something and we tend to treat a part of the body, and we tend to add some sort of therapy to the treatment that we do. Whether it's depression or diabetes, that same kind of a construct can be used. And if you think that depression won't affect your diabetes, or you think like diabetes won't affect your depression, there is some education opportunity in there. So
let me clean it up this way. I went to medical school about a decade before you did, so I'm stuck in my old ways, and I apologize.
we love you, and we have great respect for those who went to medical school 10 years before we did. Yes, sir.
Okay, but looking at this slide, we see that their cardiovascular responses, your heart rate is different, your blood pressure is different, and there's something that we don't talk about much is that HRV, heart rate variability, how your heart goes slow, goes fast. There's something called sick sinus syndrome. And we also know that there's a disease that we had problems with, which causes atrial fibrillation, which is where you get deposits of certain types of starchy type proteins in your heart. And that's a disease we talked about before with Dr. Richard Williams. Your immune response, it can actually make your blood clot quicker, and that can cause strokes and heart attack. The cytokine response from that IL-6. So there are many things that actually affect you both mentally and physically, and the brain is involved, the mind is involved, and the individual solid organs and hollow organs of the body are involved. So it's total person effect of what stress can do for you. And by stress, I don't mean emotional stress, but I mean physical stress as well as emotional stress are all involved. There's no separation between them. And just look at this list, how everything is intertwined. I just wanted to show that. You can take that down, Simon.
Dr. Maxey, Stephen Thomas here. May I ask you a question about that slide? Now that we know, and the body of evidence is really, really growing now, it's like hard to ignore. Imagine a medical home of the future. What would be the basic screening tests one would do to assess the very factors you listed there related to allostatic load? It wouldn't just be a CBC. It would be maybe a different whole battery of basic baseline tests. What would those tests be?
Well, one of the ones that comes to mind, I'm working with a company that has sensors, chemical sensors in your toilet, so that when you do number one or number two, it samples it. And that looks at parts of your metabolism. And that's not too far off. Things that can measure your temperature, your heart rate, your other physiological monitors of that. But what you excrete is probably right now the best we can do. And somehow using the toilet can do that. And it can also look at your immune system as well.
So I'm thinking about in a basic primary care practice office, doctor walks in, they come in, you're going to say, let's get your blood work. And we'll do a basic lipid panel. I mean, obviously leading cause of death, cardiovascular disease. But this allostatic load thing is doing other stuff to the kidneys. So it's more than blood pressure, more than heart rate, more than EKG. The question I'm sitting here saying is, do we know something when we're dealing with Black people in a racist society? You need to do a inflammation test or something else that we're not doing routinely. Because it sounds like these things exist. When I look down that list, there are measures for each one of those things.
Inflammation is one of the biggest things. In fact, we have a debate all along with our some of our functional doctors on looking at inflammation. One of the monitors of that is a C-reactive protein.
There you go.
It does measure increased inflammation in the body. That's still a very gross measurement. It's not very specific. We used to look at homocysteine. That is not a very good measure. And it's been recently ruled out as something that we should really look at well.
Okay.
I'm thinking that at some point, we want to look at things like transcranial magnetic stimulation, where we look at things more electronically.
Okay.
In fact, Dr. Lawson might be a little bit more familiar with that particular technology that's starting to come. Dr. Lawson, you're familiar with that technology?
I think Dr. Lawson dropped off. He is in the middle of the Lawson Father's Day barbecue that I'm missing right now. But he's in the middle of that. Well, so let me take a stab at Dr. Thomas's question, Dr. Maxey. I think that there are a couple of factors. One is, what are the tests that show us the information that we need? And the other one, our regular contributor, Linda Hall, put in, which is a question: does Medicare pay for any of those tests? There's always going to be, what are the payers going to pay for, the insurance companies, Medicare, et cetera, and what tests are going to be useful for the things that matter to the patient and the doctor. And if I may, I want to go back to something that Dr. Exelina Bean talked about earlier, which is the gathering of information, but then not doing things with information. I remember going through training years ago and being just frustrated with the fact that we were happy to do evaluations on children and label them with one psychiatric challenge or another, but then we had no resources and no references to send them for the kind of help that they needed. So it sounds like an opportunity for us to do something that would make sense in the very different communities where we serve. Getting a baseline of information that's relevant for that patient, and then making sure that we have resources and connections in place so that something can be done with the information. Back to Dr. Thomas's comment about a place where we can build that model, a place like Maryland, with a governor who looks like many of us and who is interested in doing those kinds of things. I was surprised this past week. I don't know if many of y'all were surprised by this. There were several big cities that were in the news, and every time they had somebody stepping up to talk that was a police chief or a mayor, it could have been one of my cousins. I'm like, there's a Black mayor of Denver, Colorado?
Right.
I mean, there are so many of us in places where we can make a difference, and that's where the connections need to happen between the communities of caring and the political leadership and all the other players that need to be part of that.
Yes. Silver lining from the pandemic, because people delivered. They literally did deliver.
I think that's really good that we should do that. I'm just thinking of a retort to Tim Scott. So according to statistics, why aren't there 13 senators, Black senators in the US Congress as opposed to 2?
Because only once in a while does the Supreme Court say gerrymandering can't happen right now. Only once in a while does that happen. The rest of the time, everything is gerrymandered and it's hard for us to get people elected. So there you go. And the states, how can California have the same number of states as same number of senators as North Dakota? If stuff is based on, don't get me started. We need another 3 hours. There are a lot of structural challenges to things being fair. And so we can complain about it, or we can say we're going to work through it. So we do wind up with the occasional Barack Obama that gets in, and the occasional Wes Moore that gets in as governor of Maryland.
So that gives us
What's
all
the name
a
again?
little bit of hope. But you know that also increases our allostatic load, Dr. Walks. And there's a lot of anxiety out there. We got to help our folks deal with it in not ways that are maladaptive. We're starting to do Narcan training on the street corners. Really? We got to get on top of this.
Agreed.
Very
Agreed.
good. Well, we're at the top of our hour, and I think we've had some interesting discussion. We look forward to more. Any final words, Dr. Walks?
Yes, Dr. Maxey, it's surprising that I talk so much and I always have a final word, but my final word is I really enjoy when we have an opportunity to interact with folks like Dr. Lawson, Dr. Kervin Dawes, Dr. Thomas, and get these different perspectives based on professional activities, because it feeds the imagination. I can listen to some of the things that I get from Dr. Kervin Dawes and what's happening in Jamaica, whether it's a challenge or it's a praise report, and I can say, how can I fit some of that kind of thinking into the challenges that face me? Dr. Thomas is famous for his work with the barbershops and integrating barbershops into the health promotion system and health intervention system. So I think that we need to, especially on a day like Father's Day, when the importance of fathers and fatherhood, I hope I don't hurt anybody's feelings about this, but I think fathers matter. I think that being a man in the lives of our children matter. And I don't think that has to be the biological father. I think that can be an uncle, a grandfather, it can be a coach, it can be a teacher, it can be a barber, it can be anyone who's willing to be a positive male force in the lives of our sons and our daughters. We need our daughters to get models and visuals of what a good man should look like in that girl's life as she grows. And I think our sons need to be the kind of men that we want our daughters to be with. And whatever it is that folks identify as and however they identify themselves, we need to love all of them and accept all of them. And at the same time, for those of us who identify in the way that we identify, do the best and the most with it. And on Father's Day, celebrate fatherhood. It matters.
Can I say one thing?
Go ahead. Who's that? Go ahead.
That's Dr. Lisa.
I just want to say from me, from Jamaica, happy Father's Day to all of you fathers on the show. And actually, I was thinking about what you said. We should actually have a meeting in Jamaica, an official meeting. I'm sure I can get a deal at a nice place. And introduce you to some people here that maybe we can do some things together and help each other.
Well,
Black Health Trust Retreat. The Black Health Trust Retreat in Jamaica.
I'm going to come down to do an exploratory visit to make sure it's good for Dr. Walks to come down.
You are more than welcome. And by the way, we're looking at the problem with renal failure again, Dr. Maxey. It is now again on the agenda again.
Again, Dr. Walks, what would be a basic measure?
Hey,
right from
I'm
the
going to do
start.
something unusual for a minute and open the mic. Is Dr. Rhonda Johnson available for comment? Anybody who wants to make a comment on this Father's Day, Juneteenth?
While we're getting some other mics open, very seriously and candidly, Dr. Lisa, I am happy to come to Jamaica. I've been to Jamaica on a health visit to look at how we could work better at some point in the past. I'm happy to do that again.
Unusual for a minute and open the mic. Is Dr. Rhonda Johnson available for comment? Anybody who wants to make a comment on this Father's Day, Juneteenth?
There's Dr. Johnson. While we're getting some other mics open, we have a real delay on your audio, Dr. Johnson.
She may have had a different, she may have been running it on the live and now she's getting on for audio. Okay. If you talk, Dr. Johnson, you'll just mute your other thing.
I was on YouTube.
Yeah, you're good. You're good.
Okay.
I was right now. We can see you. You look great.
Thank you. I'm sorry I got on late because I was out celebrating today. So
right on time.
But I didn't want to miss it. But I was on YouTube listening. Happy Father's Day. That's all I want to say. Happy Father's Day to all the fathers. And I'll go to this retreat in Jamaica. And Dr. Lisa Kervin, you bring up a point around colorism. That is so real. We have our own racism in our community, but these things stem back 400 years of slavery. We can't change this overnight. We're just not going to change it overnight, but I do believe we can make impacts. We can make inroads because we have to call it out. We have to call it out when we see it, and we have to inform and educate.
Dr. Johnson, I've seen you call it out. And I would say that colorism thing you're talking about, wherever they have colonized us, wherever they have touched us, I've seen it in Africa, the colorism thing. That's
have
white
I.
supremacy. That's
is.
white supremacy.
I call
And finding out how to label these things can help our own mental health.
All right. Any other comments before we go?
And I'm serious. Welcome to Jamaica. Would love for you to come. By the way, I just came back from Ghana and seeing where we were kept as slaves and where our ancestors came from. Very moving, heartrending, in fact.
Mhm.
Thank
Yes.
you. All right. Well, Dr. Walks, Dr. Thomas, and all of our other guests on, we're glad to have you on this Juneteenth, a day before Juneteenth. Have a happy holiday and have a great Sunday. Simon, thank you very much.
Keep hope
Thanks,
alive.
everyone.